The 95 Theses, or Disputation on the Power and Hypocrisy of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has long positioned itself as America's moral compass, the self-anointed guardian of justice, equality, and the rights of the people. But behind this carefully curated facade lies a party committed not to transformation, but to maintaining the very structures of power it claims to oppose. Beneath the surface rhetoric of defending the working class, advancing women's rights, and championing progress, the party stands as a fortress for the status quo, using the language of change to obscure its allegiance to entrenched elites. Under the Biden administration, this betrayal has become glaringly obvious, exposing a hollow reliance on empty gestures and symbolic posturing that serve to perpetuate a system of control rather than challenge it. This relentless gaslighting has left a growing disillusionment among those who once trusted the party's ideals. On issues of reproductive rights, foreign policy, and economic justice, Democrats have shown themselves not as defenders of the people's interests, but as guardians of privilege and influence. Their loyalty does not lie with the principles they profess, but with the powerful interests they claim to stand against. The pretense of benevolence has faded, revealing a calculated devotion to stability over true change, to a well-rehearsed illusion rather than a commitment to justice. Failure to protect women. For years, the Democratic Party has positioned itself as the staunch defender of women's rights, placing reproductive freedom at the heart of its platform. Yet, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022, the limitations of this commitment were laid bare. Despite having control of the White House and Congress, the Biden administration failed to codify abortion rights into federal law, leaving millions of women vulnerable to a wave of restrictive state laws that immediately followed. This was a moment that called for resolute action, for using every tool available to secure reproductive rights. But instead of fighting tooth and nail, the administration largely deferred, offering symbolic support rather than decisive protection. The Biden administration had numerous options to push for reproductive rights, from lobbying Congress intensively for protective legislation to exploring executive orders that could safeguard access to abortion where possible. With widespread public support on their side, Biden could have used his office to make the protection of reproductive rights a legislative priority, rallying his party and the public for a cause that the majority of Americans support. Instead, the administration chose a path of passive advocacy, allowing reproductive rights to be a political talking point rather than a policy imperative. If the highest office in the land won't exhaust every means to protect fundamental rights, then what is the point of holding such power? Beyond abortion rights, the Biden administration's lackluster approach extends to broader issues of gender equality, such as equal pay, paid family leave, and access to affordable childcare. These issues impact the economic independence and stability of millions of women, yet little has been done to advance meaningful legislation or executive action to address them. The Democratic Party has often used the threat to women's rights as a rallying cry to garner support, yet when it comes to real action, they fall back on empty promises and symbolic gestures. For a party that claims to champion women, the refusal to fully leverage the power of the presidency to enact protections speaks volumes about its priorities and reveals an allegiance to stability over the substantive change it professes to fight for. Supporting war over diplomacy. The Democratic Party's foreign policy under the Biden administration underscores a disturbing alignment with the military-industrial complex, prioritizing intervention and strategic control over diplomacy and humanitarian aid. Billions have been directed toward escalating conflicts in Ukraine, with diplomatic avenues often taking a back seat to military aid packages. This approach reflects a commitment to preserving U.S. dominance and serving defense industry interests rather than working towards global stability and peace. In the Middle East, the unwavering support for Israel's genocide against the Palestinians continues. Democratic leaders consistently prioritize these alliances over justice, funneling significant military assistance while ignoring calls for an ethical reevaluation of this support. This stance illustrates the party's alignment not with universal human rights, but with a model of U.S. strategic dominance, a hallmark of blue MAGA, where militarism is justified under the guise of moral superiority. The reach of these policies extends to South America, where U.S. influence often disrupts democratic processes and disregards local sovereignty. The Biden administration has, for instance, maintained sanctions and interference in Venezuela, exacerbating economic hardship for ordinary citizens while strengthening the grip of U.S.-backed interests. Moreover, democratic policy in the region has shown little willingness to address the ongoing effects of decades of interventionist policies in countries such as Colombia and Honduras, where military aid and political alliances have contributed to instability and displacement. The Democratic Party's approach to South America reveals an allegiance not to the democratic values it claims to uphold, but to geopolitical strategies that reinforce U.S. influence, often to the detriment of local populations. By choosing militarized influence over genuine diplomacy and development aid, the party continues to prioritize global control over the humanitarian values it purports to champion. Abandoning domestic needs. While the Democratic Party channels vast resources into foreign conflicts, urgent domestic issues remain largely ignored. The United States faces severe crises at home, rising homelessness, inaccessible health care, and widening economic inequality, all of which demand immediate intervention. Yet these pressing challenges are continually overshadowed by the party's devotion to international military spending. Despite repeated campaign pledges to address economic disparities, expand healthcare access, and strengthen social support, the Democrats have failed to push through significant reforms. The billions allocated to foreign military aid could instead be directed toward building affordable housing, improving healthcare infrastructure, and supporting public education. However, the Democratic Party's budgetary choices expose a sustained allegiance to the military-industrial complex over fostering a fair and equitable society. Each dollar spent abroad is a missed opportunity to invest in the communities the party claims to represent, revealing an inherent disconnect between their stated values and their true priorities. By prioritizing military interests over social programs, the Democrats betray their professed commitment to progress, reinforcing a system that privileges elite interests over the basic well-being of the American people. Forced candidates and the lack of real choice. The Democratic National Committee's push to position Kamala Harris as the presumptive candidate for 2024 without a legitimate primary process epitomizes the party's disregard for democratic principles. By sidelining the possibility of an open contest, the DNC undermines the democratic process, creating an illusion of choice while effectively managing the outcome. This is far from novel. The DNC has a long history of marginalizing grassroots candidates and suppressing efforts for genuine reform that might disrupt the established power structure. The Democratic Party's approach to primaries and candidate selection illustrates a controlled process aimed not at empowering voters, but at consolidating power. Rather than supporting diverse representation, the DNC prioritizes stability, curating candidates who pose no threat to the status quo. In this orchestrated setup, representation becomes secondary to control, and democracy is reduced to a mere formality. Through this process, the party's true loyalty to continuity over meaningful choice is laid bare, revealing an allegiance to entrenched power over transformative change. Healthcare stagnation. Despite bold promises to reform healthcare, the Democratic Party has failed to make significant progress, leaving millions of Americans uninsured or underinsured. When the Biden administration assumed office with a Democratic Congress, it had a unique opportunity to pursue transformative initiatives like Medicare for all or a public option. Instead, the administration made only minor adjustments to the Affordable Care Act, falling far short of the structural reform needed to address skyrocketing costs and limited access. This reluctance to tackle healthcare reform exposes the Democratic Party's prioritization of private insurance and pharmaceutical interests over public health. For instance, the watered-down drug pricing reform in the Build Back Better plan preserved pharmaceutical profits at the expense of patients struggling to afford medications. By neglecting universal health care and caving to industry pressure, the Democrats have allowed the healthcare crisis to continue, failing the millions who expected them to prioritize public health over corporate alliances. Minimum wage in action. The stagnation of the federal minimum wage, stuck at $7.25 an hour since 2009, is a stark example of the Democratic Party's inaction on economic justice. Despite widespread support for a living wage and inflation reaching record highs, Democrats have repeatedly failed to secure a federal increase, leaving countless workers trapped in poverty. This neglect highlights a party that often champions the working class in rhetoric, but fails to deliver when it matters most. Instead of addressing income inequality, Democrats have allowed the minimum wage to remain woefully inadequate, further widening the gap between workers and corporate profits. While corporations post record earnings, low-wage workers remain unable to meet basic living costs. The party's failure to prioritize wage reform underscores its preference for stability over economic equity, allowing the gap between rich and poor to grow unchecked. Climate promises versus oil interests. The Democratic Party frequently touts itself as a leader in climate action, yet its policy choices betray an allegiance to the fossil fuel industry. Despite promises to reduce emissions and champion clean energy, the Biden administration has approved multiple oil and gas projects, undermining climate goals and impacting marginalized communities disproportionately affected by environmental degradation. This contradiction between the party's climate rhetoric and its actions reveals a loyalty to corporate interests over environmental justice. Rather than curbing fossil fuel production, Democrats have prioritized short-term stability, sacrificing meaningful climate progress. In preserving fossil fuel interests, the party jeopardizes environmental health and ignores the climate crisis's disproportionate impact on vulnerable communities. Democrats have repeatedly promised student debt relief, yet meaningful reform remains elusive. While student debt impacts millions, the Biden administration's efforts have been piecemeal at best, sidestepping the systemic issues behind the crisis. Instead of providing comprehensive relief, the Democrats have opted for temporary measures, leaving countless borrowers with crushing debt. This reluctance to address student debt highlights a disconnection between the Democratic Party's platform and its policies. Rather than confronting educational inequities, Democrats have allowed predatory lending practices to persist, restricting economic mobility and perpetuating inequality. The party's inaction has left millions burdened by debt, undermining young people's ability to invest in their futures. Inadequate housing policies. Despite a worsening housing crisis, the Democratic Party has failed to enact substantial housing reform. The lack of affordable housing and rising rents have left millions struggling, yet the administration's response has been minimal. The Democrats' unwillingness to tackle housing issues reveals a preference for catering to real estate interests over providing safe, affordable housing. Rather than implementing bold policies to address homelessness and housing insecurity, Democrats have allowed the crisis to grow, prioritizing stability over transformation. By failing to address the housing crisis, they have neglected vulnerable communities and exposed their deference to powerful real estate interests. Corporate-friendly economic policies. While claiming to support economic equity, Democrats continue to push policies that benefit corporations and the wealthy. Instead of pursuing meaningful tax reform, the party has supported tax breaks and subsidies that disproportionately benefit the elite, widening the wealth gap and leaving working-class Americans with the economic burden. This prioritization of corporate interests over working people reveals the Democratic Party's loyalty to big business. Rather than challenging economic inequity, Democrats have reinforced a system that enriches the few at the expense of the many, betraying their commitment to economic justice. Conclusion. The results of gaslighting. The Democratic Party's identity as a defender of progress and justice is nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, a strategy designed to sustain power rather than pursue meaningful change. From reproductive rights to economic justice, from healthcare to foreign policy, the party's record reveals a commitment not to the people it claims to represent, but to the very structures of power it purports to oppose. This hollow shell, cloaked in the rhetoric of progressivism, is rotten to the core. A party that uses the language of reform only to deepen its allegiance to corporate interests, military dominance, and entrenched elite control. The time has come for mass abandonment of the Democratic Party. Continuing to support this institution is to be complicit in the very injustices it claims to fight against. We must confront the reality that reform from within is not only unlikely, but designed to fail. The Democratic Party is a machine for maintaining the status quo, not a vehicle for genuine transformation. If there is to be real progress, it will not come through this corrupted institution. Now is the moment to consider new political movements and parties that are committed to challenging this broken system head-on. Parties that are built from the ground up to represent the people rather than to manipulate them. Only by rejecting the hollow promises and symbolic progressivism of the Democrats can we create the space for authentic, transformative change. What points would you add that I may have missed? Leave those in the comments below and I'll address them in future videos. Please consider subscribing, every little bit helps. Till next time.